Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Yes, indeed, ladies and gentlemen, welcome one and all to our 19th episode of the Constitution of American Life with the Friends of Publius. This episode signifies two important moments in our program schedule. First, it is our final episode of the 2025 National Finals season. And secondly, this episode almost always corresponds with opening day of Major League Baseball. And this episode does as well, which for me and my friends are probably more significant than Inauguration Day. I would say that we pay more attention to opening day than we do Inauguration Day. And why is that? Well, opening day in baseball is the one day in which hope prevails. It is the day in which all 30 teams possess an optimism that glory and victory are just 162 games down the road. Even Cubs and Brewer fans are bubbly with faith and hope that their teams will prevail. Whereas on Inauguration Day, nearly half the country is preparing to get screwed in some way, shape, or form by the party now occupying the White House. It is a day in which hope goes to die, or at least ends up in a prison cell in El Salvador. So in this, our last discussion, we are going to be addressing Unit 5's topic of free speech in the public arena, a topic I can't quite figure out what the writers of the question were inspired by. That's supposed to sound more ironic than it does, or sarcastic or something. But we will do our best to bring to life this innocuous issue and the myth of free speech. That's what Professor Kavanaugh has taught me, is that you only get free speech once. I think that's the rule that I've learned through the 4 years of being together here. The myth of the right of the people to write and say what they feel about their government while standing on public property. So along with our final attempt to find clarity on the First Amendment, let's see if we can also find clarity on historical events and check in with our friends on their thoughts of this day in history, 1972. The Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, passes the Senate and is sent to the states. Is this a need to know, nice to know, or nuts to know moment in history, Professor Williams?
Oh man.
I can tell that Professor Moore is real excited about this subject.
Look, it's somewhere for me, it's somewhere between maybe nice to know and need to know. And the rationale would be that this is at the tail end of the civil rights movement, and it looked like it was gonna have enough strength to get through. And it obviously did not. So I think it's important for students. I think it's kind of a good bracket. Maybe you think about 1955 and the Montgomery bus boycott, and then you think about this amendment going out. That was about 20 years of a lot of changes happening. This one just didn't quite have the momentum to get across the finish line.
Professor Moore.
I guess I never consciously thought up until this very second to think about well, most things after 1800 I don't think about very much, but Mike's framing of it's the let's see this 72 as the end of the civil rights movement. So if that's the case, I say it's need to know, because I think in history it's nice to say, okay, where did it begin and where did it end? So just listening to Mike, I'm moved from maybe nice to know, but I think I like that framing that it's the end of the civil rights move. It's typical for a window of time culturally, so I like that. I go need to know.
Professor Kavanaugh.
I'm probably going to go with Mike on this one simply because it wasn't ratified.
It's because you're sexist, both of you.
Well, I caused a kerfuffle at one point when I was discussing this with someone and said, well, we really don't need it if we would just live up to the 14th Amendment. Because the 14th Amendment just says all persons are supposed to be treated equally under the law. All persons are supposed to be given due process under the law. If we would simply do that, there'd be no need. But we don't do that because we know we have sexism and racism embedded into many of our systems. So, there's a debate whether or not it's still alive. I don't know that. I'm not sure where I fall on which side of the fence there, but I think it's probably I'm closer to need to know to think that okay, it's 1970s and we're still debating whether or not we should talk about equality for the sexes.
Well, yeah, I'm with, well, I'm going to say nuts to know, partly because of issues that Professor Kavanaugh brought up. One, it was not ratified, and two, it wasn't necessary to begin with. You have a 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, so we didn't need a special amendment for the ladies. So nuts to know, take that to the bank here. So thank you, gentlemen, for your astute insights. And now let's begin our discussion on expressive activity in the public
Wait a
domain.
minute. I gotta slow down. I mean, whoa. I mean,
I is your better half around, Dave? Because you're going to get that freedom of speech at one time before you get.
No, I
Okay.
think she'd probably agree with me. She's got a 14th Amendment, just like you and I do.
Okay.
Just like, what do we need a special one for women? When no state shall deny any person within the jury. I believe women are persons. So anyway, I forgot where I was. Anyway, but thank you for your insights. Now we're going to talk about expressive activity in the public domain. And we're going to start with our friend who loved higher learning so much, he worked very hard to stay as long as he could, 11 years, in the bosom and comfort of student life before he ventured out into the darkness of the real world and getting a job in academia, one of the toughest areas to work in America, especially these days. So let's start with Dr. James Michael Williams, professor of political science at the University of San Diego. So Mike, expressive activity on public domain. So before we get into, our freedom of expressive moment here, I do believe that there's some vocabulary terms that we all need to be on the same page with, and that is speech as an absolute right, because I heard that for so long, maybe not in those terms, but the way it was viewed and treated by students, fellow staff members, and other adults combined, that hey, I have my right, it's my right of free speech. In a way, it's absolute. Speech versus action, speech versus action analysis, content neutral versus content-based analysis. So there's a few things there. Let's start off with speech as an absolute right. All right. How would you deal that in a law class or in your political science class?
Well, I was thinking about this question, and my experience in constitutional law and my First Amendment class would have been a lot easier if it was just an absolute right. If we just went with what Hugo Black said, right? It says Congress shall make no law. No law means no law. Let's move on. That is not where we're at. So it is not an absolute right. There are all sorts of different types of exceptions and qualifications and things that we need to take into account. And you mentioned some of them. I guess we can start. The court has said there are just some types of expression that will just not be seen as speech under the First Amendment. For example, obscenity is just something where the court says if it's defined as obscenity, we're not going to even do our free speech analysis. There are other ones, fighting words, and a few others. So there's about 7 of these categories where the court has just said over the past 250 years, we're not even going to count this as speech. So students should be aware of those different categories. I can go into more detail if you want me to, but they're out there.
What about content neutral versus content?
Yeah. So the court, so for example, if a local municipality passes a law and it says, on the city sidewalk between 5 and 8 p.m., no one can hold up a sign saying, "Go Republicans." The court is going to look at that as a content-based restriction. And while it is not going to be automatically ruled unconstitutional, it's going to be held to strict scrutiny, and that one would be held probably most definitely unconstitutional because it's content based. If, on the other hand, if the same city put up passed a law and they said between the hours of 5 to 8 p.m. in our city, no one can hold up a sign at this intersection, and we need to have that because it's a busy intersection. People are going to be looking at the signs instead of watching the intersection. That's a safety issue. No speech allowed at all. That would be considered content neutral, and the court would then go through an analysis, and it wouldn't provide such high scrutiny to go through it. They'd still have to make sure that what the government entity, how they want to restrict it, is going to be all right. But that'd be considered content neutral.
So then let's get to speech versus action doctrine and
Yeah,
analysis. And this is where I guess to me it gets a little bit fuzzy. In
yeah.
based upon speech as absolute, it seems in the speech versus action analysis, speech is absolute, but action is not. In what ways am I not getting that right?
Well, I would say that even as we just talked about, speech is not absolute. It would seem to me, but there are the government can put time, place, and manner restrictions on your speech for sure. That's a separate issue as to action. Action is it's supposed to be this clear line, but the case law on this gets really murky really quickly. But basically, if you do something besides using your words or using your words, if I'm yelling at you, but if at any point I make an action towards assaulting you, that would be considered a different that would not be considered speech. That would be considered an action. So we're looking for some sort of physical manifestation of the speech um, in a way that I'm not describing this too well. Yeah, I'm going to stop there and let you poke some holes in that.
Well, one of the most famous cases is the Skokie case and Nazis marching in a predominantly Jewish township. All
Yeah,
right. And now it never reached the Supreme Court, is my understanding. But the court that dealt with it said they're protected under the First Amendment. But
yeah.
how is their action, all right, caused harm? Wasn't that enough? All right, isn't that enough? All right, for society to say, you know what? Again, marching down the street in a Jewish community, we're not talking about your words, just the very act, and especially if you're wearing uniforms and you got the swastika, which I guess extends to symbolic speech, that
Sure.
causes a harm that is irreparable.
Yeah, there's a couple things there to analyze. That is in the Skokie case, they received a permit. They went to the city. They said we want to have a parade, and under municipality law, we can have a parade. We'll set aside. There was nothing in the law, and it would not be constitutional if there was something in the law that said anyone can march and can get a permit to march, except for Nazis. That would be considered content based. And the action of marching, and I know we're probably going to get into this if this is what the founders had in mind. The action of walking is considered expressive activity. Now, if during that parade, if one of the marchers punched someone or threw something or did something in a physical way to a bystander or to someone's property, then that would be considered an action and that would not be considered speech. So that's the line that we're trying to draw there between speech and action.
Okay, thank you on clarifying some of that. So, Professor Moore, again, the question, the We the People material, civic education, and we can talk about all the different categories. They all treat speech as maybe the most fundamental right, all right, that exists in constitutional democracies and in ours specifically. So I'm wondering if that's true, why didn't the framers of the Constitution include this protection for all Americans? Because we know they included it in a guess a limited way for members of the representative branch. But why didn't they include it for all Americans in the body of the Constitution? Why do we have to wait for the Bill of Rights before this Right.
It's a great question, but I don't think they thought speech was that important. What they did now, however, they did think they did think that assembling and petitioning was uber important. I mean, some of this has to do with the context. Well, a lot of it has to do with the context, because I think this. I mean, to me, it's even fuzzier now when we talk about freedom of expression, which that means it's even more murkier than just speech. So, at the back at the founding, I mean, you look at this and all there's a lot of emphasis on assembly and petition because, they thought that the collective nature of speechifying at their elected officials, and by the way, it was almost always framed in terms of political, not personal, fulfillment. So there's a tremendous emphasis on petitioning and assembly. That's the mechanism of speech. If we want to, like, it's okay, where is speech at the founding? It's in petitioning and assembly. It's interesting. Blackstone has this this piece where he talks about assembly, and he says unlawful assembly is more than three. And then there's this other kind of assembly he labeled tumultuous petitioning. Uh, doesn't define, well, I mean, he kind of defines, unlawful assembly in terms of numbers, but, it's kind of comical when you read Blackstone's in 1769 how he's trying to wrestle with this idea of assembly and petitioning. But petitioning is a deeply rooted thing within the British tradition, and certainly in the American Revolution, there's petitions all over the place that's going across the ocean to either Parliament or the Crown. So, the Continental Congress in their Declaration of Resolves in 75 talks about assembly and the connection of assembly to petitioning. Um, in the ratification debates, there's a tremendous, your question is kind of an anti-federalist question. Why the heck, you've got these few rights listed in the body. Why did you stop there? Now, after that, the anti-federalists always talk about petitioning and assembly. They don't talk in terms that we use now in terms of speech. So it's a great anti-federalist question.
But it
State
must,
constitutions.
can I
I'm
ask
sorry,
you,
go
but
ahead.
it must have been somewhat important, Tim, because they have a speech and debate clause in the body of the Constitution for members of Congress. So it's
Right.
important enough for members of Congress, but not for the general citizen.
Yeah, the argument is, well, this is part of the Federalist argument that representation is enough. The representation system within the Constitution is enough for your opinions to be heard. So it's kind of connected to that. The filtering notion of representation means that speech for you isn't that important. But we do want the political piece of assembly and petitioning. And also tied to this, it's interesting in the first Congress, when they're talking about, after Madison proposes X, Y, and Z for bills of in the Bill of Rights, on August 15, there's this long discussion about this idea of instructions from individuals as well as from state legislatures. Do individuals and do state legislatures have the power to instruct their representatives at the national government? And it's almost like they're talking about this input that in the colonial era equaled assembly and petitioning. Would now instructions be the right that should be in a Bill of Rights? And that would kind of take the place of political speechifying to representatives in Congress.
Um, I think I would throw press on there with what Tim was talking about, a
Yes,
petition, with
yes.
petition and assembly,
Yeah, I'm
because
sorry. Chris is absolutely right.
press freedom was a huge thing, obviously.
Yeah.
And they even debated putting that in the body. But I think back to the idea of speech per se is that, well, if we put it in there, does that mean we thought we had the ability to regulate it to begin with? So they left that out. We've talked about that before. And I think in terms of the speech and debate clause too, David, there's also in there because of past practices, because they've seen what's happened in England, and
Yeah.
because members of parliament had been threatened for speaking out. So we want to make sure we provide for an open debate within our legislature. So we're going to protect folks with the speech and debate clause in Congress. Matt.
So is that the general? I mean, again, that's a classic argument you hear by Federalists of why there's not a necessity for a Bill of Rights. That is, if you enumerate it, you imply that the government has the power to regulate it. So is that the argument on press, assembly, and petition of why they don't put those in the body?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So it's pretty clear there. So, Chris or Professor Kavanaugh, I'm going to make a statement, and then I'm going to ask you to slap me down some. So, in my opinion, we overly
can I join in?
In my opinion, we overly romanticize freedom of speech as having had significant impact on history. One example that I'll use for all the expressive speech during the Vietnam War, it did not, all right, bring that war to an end. Okay, there is no empirical evidence, all right, that the Nixon administration ended the war because of all the protests. In fact, there's some evidence to show it actually prolonged it in some ways. So I'm wondering if you can identify, one, you can disagree with me on that, of course, but can you identify any event, period in history in which you believe freedom of speech altered the path in history in, I guess, a positive way?
Well, I definitely would get to disagree with the premise of your question, because even if we, in your example, I'm going to pull an Eisenhower trick and say, how long would it have lasted without the protests? How long would the Vietnam War have lasted without the protests? And how would it have ended without the protests? We don't know that. That's a counterfactual thing. And I want to go back to an idea. I know we're focusing on speech, but I think we also have to include the other liberties within the First Amendment that Tim already alluded to, and that's petition and assembly. Because those, we know that speech, press, petition, and assembly are all political rights. They're designed to be political rights to allow people to participate in the political realm. So I think I hate to just take out freedom of speech out of that nexus of rights. But I'll give you one, David. The Enlightenment.
Okay, that's kind of a broad.
No freedom of speech. You don't get Rousseau.
Are you talking about the French Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, the English Enlightenment, or the American Enlightenment?
Sure, all of them. All of them.
Okay, within the confines of American history, 1789. All right, constitutional history.
You didn't say that. You said.
I know, okay, I am now revising. All right,
to narrow the discussion. Is that goalpost being moved back?
No, they're just fine.
Okay,
I asked you to slap me down, and you're doing that very well.
The civil rights movement, right? The modern civil rights movement, without freedom of speech, without freedom of petition, without freedom of assembly, without freedom of the press, would the civil rights movement have been effective as it was? And I would argue the Vietnam War movement actually was successful, because again, what would it have looked like without America turning against the war? So
yeah, I'm sorry, Chris.
Well, I was going to say another one. How about the abolitionist movement leading up to the Civil War?
It changed the course.
The Vietnam protest. All right, I'll meet you halfway, David. Here, the Vietnam War protests did not end the Vietnam War, but it got us the 26th Amendment.
Okay. Okay, so altered the path, the course of history. Okay. Mike, you want to slap around there? Anything to add to that?
I think it's a really good question. I'm trying to think of moments.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
No, it is. It's a good question.
So I go back to my premise. What would it look like without it?
Yeah. Well, we can't prove that. What I'm saying is, what did it do? Is you can't show me. All right. I mean, the peak of that movement is 1968-69. All right. What it does do in many ways is, I think it incentivizes the administration to maybe do some of their foreign policy in more draconian ways.
I got
The bombing activity, the movement into Laos and Cambodia and such. But again, I understand your point, Chris. What I'm looking at is the facts on the ground. And I
yeah.
don't see, in fact, and again, we can see by 1970, 71, the American public's turning against the protesters.
Well, the
It's
bombing of Sterling Hall doesn't help that. When you've got, here at UW-Madison, they blew up the math building. So I think how speech went sideways, to your point that the culture at large got fed up with a lot of speech. So,
yeah.
so I think the 71 bombing of Sterling Hall and other things around the country may have contributed to the didn't end the war idea.
I I think it's, I mean, I do think it's a good question. I think it's tricky because it's hard to disentangle the focus on speech versus then the distribution of that speech. So I was thinking about the Selma March and how that played a significant that the right to that assembly and that march played a significant role in getting the 65 Voting Rights Act passed. But that it probably in all the civil rights speechifying, petitioning, if Americans are not seeing it on TV, then maybe it doesn't have the effect. And then I was trying to think back to pre-revolution, right? Thinking back to pain and common sense. And because America was in a society where maybe there wasn't the freedom of speech the way we think about it, but there was the ability under colonial law, printing presses and things, that had an enormous impact on what people thought about revolutionary principles. And you can imagine at that very same time in the 1700s, in a different part of the world like Russia or Prussia, there's not going to be that same culture of the idea of the value of the right to speech, and maybe that does alter it. But it's tricky for me about the distribution of it and not just the speech.
Okay, good. So to you, Professor Williams, um, in the modern age, we're now looking at, as we look at expressive action, we're looking at digital expression through the medium of social media and the platforms that have been created. I'm wondering, to what degree do you believe social media has served to expand the marketplace of ideas in a positive way?
Yeah. Um, I'm not sure I'm convinced it has. I can give you some of the arguments that are out there on it.
Please do.
Yeah. So now with our devices, it has small d democratized expression. You can go on a social platform and you can put out your information and a lot more people are going to hear it. I mean, heck, this thing we're doing right now, putting it on YouTube is a way where we get to share our ideas to a wider audience in a way that we couldn't do before social media. So that's one. You could argue that it leads to a diversity of perspectives, that if you don't put yourself in an echo chamber, that you could see a lot of different perspectives that you wouldn't see just by sitting in our homes in Bakersfield or El Cajon, wherever we're at, right? So I think that's another factor. The fact we were just talking about the dissemination, like we can spread information so much faster than we used to through social media. And then finally, I guess like citizen journalism, the opportunity of, and I know that maybe, um, not sure, yeah, the ability for people to record things going on and then hold those people accountable, getting that message out there. I think those are all ways that it could be seen as positive. Um, the examples that are often brought up are like the Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter. But to your point, a question ago, what legislation passed because of Black Lives Matter? As much as I was in favor of that movement, did it actually lead to any public policy changes, or the Occupy movement? And in the Arab Spring, there's one country that's semi-democratic after all that tumult. So we could question whether all these positive things I just mentioned are actually leading to public policies that are actually making life better. Now, your question was about the marketplace of ideas. Yes, I think that what I just spoke about kind of makes that argument. But there's also the flip side of all that, the echo chambers, the spread of hate speech, the fact that we aren't getting a diversity of ideas. That's all based on what we choose to do with our devices, how much we want to open ourselves up to that.
Well, I would also,
Go
on
ahead,
top
Chris.
of that, I would add on, it also depends on the people that control the platforms.
That's a good point.
When the platforms are, being controlled by oligarchs, or the super wealthy, and now they get to open the faucet or close the faucet, if you will, however they see fit, to amplify certain messages or to limit certain messages. Um, and not even to the whole idea of, I know we've talked about on this program before, Section 230 of the Communications Act, and the idea of, will people that run these platforms be held accountable for what may be considered reprehensible speech? And they keep, the argument is, we keep hearing the idea that we want more free speech, more free speech, but we also know that certain people that control certain platforms actually limit that speech. So
And I mean, my job is to ask the questions and hopefully bring about some a wider uh, breadth of ideas here. I actually agree with you guys that in if, of the more traditional forum of public expression, we can go to again the abolitionist movement. We can go to the suffrage movement, obviously the civil rights movement. There are tons of movements in which that First Amendment, whether it be speech, petition, assembly, has altered the path. Well, now we add this digital. And Mike, you mentioned some of the movements in which digital expression or expression through the digital process has maybe enhanced, all right, the ability to access. But isn't the trade-off that is, I'm wondering from your perspective, there's always been disinformation and misinformation campaigns, but it seemed to me that before the digital world, it was easier for society to clamp down on that and to temper the impact of false or fake news or disinformation, misinformation. Isn't it too high of a price to pay to allow this digital freedom if it also means uh, a massive increase in the role and impact of misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, it might be. I mean, you can think about the misinformation around January 6th or around COVID as examples. Um, and I think I think if we do this again next year, it's going to be beyond social media. We're going to be talking about AI and AI generated. Like, how do you even know what you're seeing and hearing is actually real, right? Um, the what we have to grapple with is, how do you put that genie back in the bottle? How do you now regulate this? And at this time, there's no appetite, it seems to me, with those in power, and I think with the American public, to regulate it at all. Getting to something yeah, this idea that we all have the absolute freedom to say what we want, kind of thing.
Chris?
I think the contrast for the students watching, the contrast what Mike was and Dave were just saying with what happens in some European countries, because you see in some European countries the willingness for much stricter controls for what they allow on their public airwaves, or the on the internet.
Yeah,
Uh, we don't seem to have a stomach for that because of our adherence to the First Amendment. That's the argument. But if you compare us to what happens, say, in England, um, very, very different. Very, very different.
I
yeah.
wonder about, I mean, there's been a lot of talk in the last 10 years about the absence of gatekeepers.
Mhm.
The editorial board at the New York Times, the editorial board at the fill in the blank, whatever the reputable news organizations were the gatekeepers of national discourse. So I wonder if we're ever, I mean, I don't know if we can put the toothpaste back in the tube on this one, but it would seem to me if we stand a snowball's chance in hell of ever making effective changes, it would have to include mutually agreed upon gatekeepers, which, holy cow, mutually agreed upon gatekeepers now. I mean, we had that time period
I
when
would
we
say
had, ABC, CBS, and ABC, the Walter Cronkite, and the official, person that told us what to think, and we trusted them. I don't know that we can
Well,
do it without reestablishing mutually agreed upon gatekeepers.
I would agree. I think we were heading in that direction, especially if you read about the current history of Facebook or even X before Musk took over. I think, content monitoring and the things that were being pushed upon these platforms, I think we were moving in that direction. I would agree with you now, Tim, that given where we are now, there's no way to put that toothpaste back. Chris, you were going to jump in.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I absolutely agree with what you're saying, David, because we saw the content moderation happening because they didn't want the government to step in and do it. So we're going to do it ourselves. But now that ship has sailed, and I would say, Tim, I think it's not a set of agreed upon gatekeepers, but a set of agreed upon rules for the gatekeepers, because we're always going to have those gatekeepers, right? We talk about Federalist, anti-Federalist press back in the day, and the founding era, you go back even earlier than that or later than that, there's always going to be opinionated gatekeepers putting certain messages out. But I think that we have to have an agreed upon set of rules for the gatekeepers
Yeah.
in terms of that.
And
And I don't know if that's I'm sorry, Mike. I don't know if that's an abolishment of Section 230 or redoing Section 230 or how that works. I don't know.
I kind of have a working, I don't know if it's a hypothesis or if it's just a wish that because I think this change has to occur at the grassroots level. I mean, I think it has to at some point people decide, you know what, I feel so much crappier after I'm spend an hour of doom scroll. Forget it, I'm not doing it anymore, right? And that maybe there'll be a little bit of a backlash against it. I'm thinking about like I know this is maybe not a great example, like smoking, right? And and how heck, my mom was a nurse. My mom smoked when she was pregnant with me, and she kind of knew better, but she really didn't. I mean, there were mixed messages out there at the very least, right? Well, that completely radically changed, as we know, in the United States, and I'm wondering if that could happen as well. I mean, I'm thinking I got my first iPhone the year my kids were born, and they're now 16. And I've kind of been dealing with social media and even the internet, right? Not really having a playbook, not even thinking through, is it all good or all bad? And I'm hoping that my kids, when they are raising theirs, are going to have a little more perspective and a little maybe do some of their own gatekeeping within their own nuclear or communities, nuclear families or communities. That's my hope at least, but who knows?
Keep hope alive, my friend. Keep
Yeah,
hope
right. I
alive
know.
there. Kind of stuff. So, Professor Moore, the question that the students have to deal with states two different times that free speech on public property has potential conflicts with other constitutional values and interests. From your perspective, what are those values and interests, and who determines when those values take precedence over free speech?
Well, the answer to the second question is courts.
Okay.
Uh, and there's all these cases are hilariously these cases are very interesting. Um, I mean, the whole public forum doctrine is fascinating. You got the court has established tiers. There's like a pure public forum, a quasi public forum, and it's not public at all. So they've created this tier, almost like levels of scrutiny in how they evaluate a public forum. So that's first of all, I think, interesting in and of itself. And then the cases, one of which was actually here just down the road, a couple miles in Brookfield, Wisconsin, whether there were some folks hollering in front on the sidewalk at a doctor's home. who performed abortions. And so, so there's this right of a right of on public property. Does that impinge on a person's constitutional right of privacy? So there's a potential conflict of a constitution. There's also the public safety. We saw some of this. We saw this all over the country, including here in Waukesha, in Milwaukee, during the George Floyd. I mean, shutting down highways during rush hour. Okay, I'm protesting on a public highway, but again, it's during a critical time of traffic. There's always the general public safety that's at risk. So I would students are going to have if not have already had a field day of looking into the minutia of airports. There's another. I read a case last night. Is this impugn on my constitutional right to get to travel if I can't get to my gate on time because of protests in airports? So when you combine the public forum criteria with does it conflict with other constitutional principles? That it's just absolutely wonderful. And I would urge students to really have a field day with because there's a lot of fertile ground for differing opinions on whether speech in a public on a public forum is legit or not. So yeah, I think the public safety, the privacy piece come to mind real quickly to answer your question directly, David.
Chris?
Another area for students to take a look at clearly would be protests on campus and opposed to the war in Gaza right now, as we see. The threat, the charges of anti-Semitism, Jewish students not feeling safe, and yet we also have students that are advocating for companies or institutions to withdraw their investments from Israel. So there's you talk about a hotbed of political activism, college campuses.
Our offices on campus are right on East Campus Mall, and last week we had a remarkably long and loud set of, I'll be generous and call them protests. I could not concentrate for 4.5 hours. I had work to do, and I don't know that I have a constitutional right to that work, but yeah, constitutional right to make a living. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, I mean, it was the plaza is literally our building is right there on the plaza. So to Chris's point about college campus being ground zero in some of this stuff, because that plaza is public forum, pure.
I'm curious, Tim. Was the the draft case? Was that a Wisconsin case too?
No, I thought that was
Chris?
California. Was that
Was that
O'Brien,
California?
California?
Cohen versus
Cohen
that's
was
right. Cohen
California.
versus California.
Yeah, I thought
I wanted to give Wisconsin credit for being a hotbed of First Amendment issues.
Well,
there. Yeah,
I mean, that's passe. We've done much better than that at UW.
Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise the example I often use in class is restrictions on how close people can get to voting stations on election day. And a lot of jurisdictions have these so many feet, and that's a classic example of two fundamental rights. Well, we could debate whether voting is actually fundamental.
And we have.
See a previous episode, but if you believe that, that's why those jurisdictions will do stuff like that, because they want people to feel like they can exercise their right to vote without being intimidated by word.
We see that at clinics as well that provide services for abortion services, and I think Justice Thomas wants to revisit the zone that has been created around some of these clinics to allow people to protest right up to the door, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Professor Kavanaugh, you kind of touched on it. So let's go down that path, because I do believe what we are experiencing today, and I'm going to say this, I think this is probably the darkest period for the First Amendment since World War I, post World War I. I don't believe we had nearly as many issues in World War II. We've talked about the civil rights in Vietnam era. Obviously, they didn't have. I mean, there was attempts at repression and gamesmanship by government to suppress certain ideas. But I think today is probably one of the worst times because we've been overwhelmed in the last few months with numerous attempts to limit speech by the national government, i.e., executive orders banning DEI programs at universities and private businesses, regulating which media and press institutions have access to governmental businesses and institutions, using immigration policy to detain and deport individuals who express ideas that the administration disapproves of. It's a lot going on. I'm just wondering, because you are in the classroom, and maybe Mike and Tim is still kind of in that instructional mode. How do you guys, starting with Chris, what do you recommend to teachers? And I know, talking, still being somewhat related to the profession that I was in for so long, there are teachers who are afraid to talk about this stuff today because of the dark clouds over of the First Amendment, or denying First Amendment, that seem to exist. What do you say? What advice do you give them, Chris?
Well, first of all, I'm in total agreement with your assessment of where we are. I mean, certainly we mentioned civil rights, anti-war stuff, which led to backlashes and issues. How do you counter hate speech, more speech, kind of thing. So we saw that going back and forth throughout history. But now, back to Hugo Black, Congress shall make no law. Now we have executive order making law. I think of what we just saw with Columbia University kowtowing to the administration because the administration was holding $400 billion over their head in terms of grants. I think you hit a lot of the big nails on the head there, David, and where we are. And it's troubling. It's troubling. And I think I'm going to give you a litany of things here. First of all, as a teacher and student, you need to understand your rights. Know your rights under the First Amendment, right? But you also have to know local policies and legal precedents. You want to encourage open discussion. That's at the very nature of education, is to allow that open discussion. And you want to use classroom for platform for civic engagement being key, right? And you, as a teacher, you got to model that civil discourse. We try to do it on this program. Use legal channels as well if you need to. But you're right, because there's a fear of someone's going to come after you because you're teaching perhaps something that is going to rub people the wrong way. And I always think, this will probably warm Tim's heart. I just use the documents, right? If we're doing history, what do the documents tell us? What do the documents show us? Case in point, for us, not too long ago, we read Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech as to why there was a civil war. And this was a guy that was a vice president of the Confederacy, and he leaves no doubt. Or you look at the documents when the Southern states declared secession, or you read the Confederate States of America, you read their Constitution. What did the documents show? I think that for teachers, I think you're always on solid ground when you can bring up these are the documents. I didn't write the document, so you go there. And it's a very difficult in a situation where I just heard a person arguing about a case in school where a kid is practicing his religious rights to free exercise rights to rip on members of the LGBTQ plus community within his school. Is that allowable? And that's a tough nut to crack. So I think the teachers have to be very careful. You do have to look over your shoulder. And I can say that, in my classes, in my freshman classes, we've been covering the rise of totalitarianism in the late 20s into the early 30s because that's our state standard. So we're looking at Stalin, looking at Hitler, we're looking at Mussolini. And it's really difficult not to bring up current practices and policies because they fit right into the playbook, right? So you have to be very careful about that because you know that you're going to get a phone call, you're going to get crossways with your bosses. And that's the other thing for teachers. know your bosses and know how well your administration is going to have your back. But it's a very difficult time in the classroom.
Mike?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the word that comes, we're all kind of talking around it, students, it's kind of like the chilling effect, where there doesn't even have to be a law passed saying you don't have the right to do this. You just need to have some anticipation of the fear of it. I mean, I think the press completely blew it, right? When the AP got shut out of the Oval Office, there should have been a massive show of resistance. Um, the ABA, the American Bar Association, has said nothing about what's going on in terms of defying judges' orders, and but it's scary times, and it's even scarier than 100 years ago because of the amount of data the government has on us, because the government does so much more. It has crossed my mind because JD Vance has said that higher education is in the crosshairs, right? Um, and with Doge doing its work, I mean, you say something, you get your name out there, and does that mean I'm going to get a little stronger audit this year on my taxes? I mean, am I somehow, or we, like, could you be potentially sort of targeted? Or we know the folks who spoke out, the security folks and the folks in the administration, polling folks who spoke out are now face death threats and have had their lives completely changed um, because of what they said in public. So I'm with you, Dave, on this. I never thought I would be living in a society where you can actually kind of see and read and feel this chilling effect happening in different sectors of our lives, and I think it's real.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's worse than 100 years ago because of the changing role of government and the financial carrots
Yeah,
that have been developed. I mean, how do they get Columbia and other universities to bow down? It's federal dollars. This law firm that surrendered, and
yeah,
they're going to give, what is it, $40 million to a Trump thing? And why
yeah,
is that? Because we've given absolute authority to the president to cut off business of a private, business entity whose whole law firm is about representing people, many of them who work in the federal government and such. So yeah, I agree with you, Mike. But I think it's the financial strings that have grown so much. It's not a threat consistently in prison. It's a threat of losing maybe your livelihood down to the local school district. I
mm,
mean, when you're told there will be no DEI or you'll lose your federal dollars, now maybe we don't have to worry about it since they're working to get rid of federal dollars and the federal Department of Education. But I know that in my local district, there's some
mm,
concern about what do we do about these state mandates that are about diversity, equity, and inclusion to a great degree. Now with the federal thing about federal dollars there. So Tim, you wanted to jump in?
No, I can't say it any better than Chris and Mike and you have.
So, gentlemen, we've come
I,
to the
I,
end
I
of this discussion. Yeah, I'm sorry,
I'm
Chris.
sorry. I want to say this because I know David in the beginning of our broadcast has put himself out there, and I want to too, because I do think this has been a slow slide into authoritarianism right in front of our very eyes. And this very topic, uh, if you read Hannah Arendt, if you read Professor Snyder, if you read people that are experts on studying totalitarianism, we are there. Right, we're in a constitutional crisis. We are there. Our constitutional system is being stressed to the limit because of what's happening with our current administration. We can argue about policy all day long, but when you're running the White House like you're running a mob and you're shaking people down, it reminds me of Andrew Johnson after the Civil War, and when the wealthy elite former enslavers would come and kiss his ring personally, then he would grant them amnesty. This is kind of, to me, where we are, and it's very scary and very troubling. So I just wanted to put that out there on the broadcast.
yeah.
All right. Gentlemen, final thoughts and recommendations for this Unit 5 question on freedom of expression on public property or in the public forum. So Professor Williams.
Yeah, this is the kind of question where um, you could possibly think about a lot of hypotheticals. Well, what if this, and what if that, and what if this? And my recommendation for the students as you're thinking about this, whether this is your unit or not, is I think you kind of have to know the definitions we went over earlier. Make sure you know the difference between a public and non-public. Um, and then to the best of your ability, think about what principles you really believe as a group or as an individual. And no matter what sort of hypothetical you get, stay true to that principle. Um, I wouldn't get caught up on trying to keep up with every hypothetical. And also, um, local examples. I think if you can have some case studies of how this is happening in your local community, either presently or in the past, free speech issues, I think that those would be also really wonderful to share during your hearing.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, this is to further Mike's point, I can see this question at nationals being some judge will give you a hypothetical and use your studies of cases to answer those hypotheticals. So create your criteria. To Mike's point, the three forms of public forum and argue from those cases. And so I think this is I mean, to me, this is a very fun question because it's so the case law can take you in so many different places. So I would use those cases to make to construct your answers, especially in follow-ups.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Ditto with what those guys said, because you are going to get Justice Breyer across from you at some point, giving you some crazy hypo that you got to try and figure out. In regards to that, make sure you check out dissenting opinions, right? Look at the dissents in some of the very famous cases. And if you go back, we talk about the values within the Constitution, right? What are those values, or what does it mean to be an American? So if we value the First Amendment and the liberties that it provides, then how far should that extend? How far do we protect those liberties and these values, and what does it mean? And if we're not willing to protect them, then is it really all that great to be an American if we're not willing to live up to the values that we say we have? One other thought too, and I've mentioned this before. One of my favorite speeches is from Judge Learned Hand in his Spirit of Liberty speech, and it's an excerpt of it is in this handy dandy little pocket constitution, but you can find it online as well. And he says, what is the spirit of liberty? It's one that is not too sure that it's right. And I think that's important for us to remember in this day and age when we're quick to castigate people we disagree with. We have to allow that room for people that we disagree with, as distasteful as it may be.
So one of the reasons I love meeting with my friends here is I always walk away with some knowledge that I didn't have before. And I found out today that Mike's mom smoked while he was in utero, which seems to explain everything about Mike we need to know. And I just want to say, Mike, my mom did too. So that means you and I, another one as well. So Tim's the only pure one. Which explains his encyclopedic knowledge about
I think
the
that means
topic.
we all turned out normal.
Yeah.
That's right.
He's the abnormal one there. So yeah. Students and teachers, as I said, this is our last episode. My three friends, they're going to be judging at the national finals. I am not, for a variety of reasons. It's just time for me to check out after, gosh, I don't know how many years since the beginning. I've been involved since the beginning, and another trip back to national finals is just too much on the mind and body. So do me a favor, if you have one of these gentlemen as a judge, please, don't assume that their question has merit. Question the assumption of their questions, and don't hesitate to push back a little bit on these guys because they'll enjoy it, and I believe you would score points because again, they're gentle. I mean, they slap me around, but they do it with a glove on their hand there. So as I said, to all of you, students, teachers, and the generally curious. This has been a great season. I've enjoyed every session we've had. As I said, I walk away learning something either about my friends or about the Constitution, General Society, or history there. I'm hoping we've provided you with some insights and some ways to look at these questions that hopefully make the light come on or come on brighter for you. As always, we cannot predict whether we will be back for another season. We'll look at the data and see if there's still enough interest that justifies us giving our time to you there, and whether or not it has value. And heck, we cannot even predict whether constitutional democracy will be around next August. So until then, given all that, we wish all of you good luck at the national finals, and want to remind you that you have already accomplished much just by being in attendance. We recommend that you let your coaching guide you, to let go of any anxiety, and to allow your personality to shine and to enjoy the experience, because you will never pass this way again. So as always, bye-bye, bye bonds, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Hopefully see some of you teachers next year. Bye-bye.